mission, our focus is that we want to be a community that is centered on the gospel, that makes disciples of Jesus, that know and enjoy him. And one of our core values as a community is that we're centered on the gospel. How do we look at life from a biblical gospel lens? And today we have an opportunity to hear from Aaron Brake, which I'll invite in a little bit. Aaron has he served on our elder board. He served on our welcome team and has taught many different courses at our church on cults, on theology, and even what we're going to talk about today, pro-life apologetics. And the reason why I asked Aaron to come was last Sunday was Sanctity of Life Sunday, and unfortunately I couldn't be here because I was at a wedding, so I didn't want to miss it. So I asked him to speak this Sunday, and I think it's still relevant, obviously, with all the stuff that we hear in the media. There's just a couple things that stand out in my mind in the past month about the things culture has to say about abortion and all these different things. So I asked Aaron to come to just equip us, because I know that some of us are at Biola, some of us are in at Cal State Long Beach City, but I think it's just good for us to equip ourselves with truth and equip ourselves for a lot of these ideas that are out there. And how do we argue faithfully? How do we articulate our faith in a loving and gracious way, in the ways that Christ would? And I think Aaron models that extremely well. Aaron is very knowledgeable. He loves Jesus, but really he's just very gracious. And I think we have a lot to learn from him. So if you could welcome up Aaron Brake.
As Alan mentioned, usually the third Sunday of every January is Sanctity of Life Sunday. January 22nd is actually the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, which was passed in 1973. And so usually during this week, you'll see media attention and controversy over the issue of abortion. And last Friday, for example, there was a March for Life in Washington, D.C., where we had thousands of people marching for the pro-life cause. And so today what we're going to be talking about is the case for life, and present you with a case for pro-life apologetics. So starting talking about this issue, I want to discuss real quickly why do we talk about this issue in the first place, right? This is a very divisive, a very contentious issue in our culture. People can be very mean-spirited in discussing this topic, but I want to give you three quick reasons about why I think this topic is important. The first reason is that the stakes are so high in this debate. And this is true whatever side of the debate you fall on, whether you side on the pro-choice side or the pro-life side. Let's think about the pro-choice side for a minute. Those who are pro-choice believe this is such an important issue because it's fundamentally an issue about women's rights, right? And so when pro-life advocates try to pass legislation, they think that this legislation is anti-women, right? And so sometimes the pro-life side is characterized as religious, anti-science, anti-woman, that we are infringing on what a woman can and cannot do with her own body. Let's think about the pro-life side. Why does the pro-life side see this issue as important? Because the pro-life side sees abortion as the intentional killing of an innocent human being. And so what that means is that since Roe v. Wade, 60 million unborn human beings have been killed through abortion. That's the United States alone. And so that's why both sides of this debate are so passionate on this issue. One side views this issue as fundamentally a women's rights issue, and the other side sees it as a human rights issue. The second reason is this. Because a persuasive, logical defense of a pro-life position is rarely heard. Sometimes the pro-life view is characterized as religious or anti-science, or as I mentioned before, anti-woman. But I don't think that's accurate at all. And so my goal this morning is to present you guys with what hopefully is a well-reasoned and persuasive, a winsome case for the pro-life view that is based on science and philosophy. And so if you find yourself agreeing with me in what I say this morning, I hope that you are better prepared and more equipped to engage others in conversation. If you find yourself disagreeing with me, then I hope to at least give you something important to think about on this topic, and I encourage you to further think about this topic as you go forth from today. The third reason is this, because I think Scripture requires us to do so. In Luke 10, Jesus gives us the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in this parable, Jesus says that we are to love our neighbor, not just in word alone, but also in action and in deed. And so when it comes to the unborn who are in the womb, we have to ask the question, is the unborn my neighbor? The answer to that question is yes, if the unborn is a human being. And if that's the case, then I think we have a responsibility to love and protect them, and then to defend their right to life. If the unborn are human beings, then loving our unborn neighbors can't include killing them simply because they're unwanted. Before I get into the case this morning, I want to deal with a couple distractions. When it comes to the issue of abortion, as I said before, it's a controversial, contentious issue, and there are all sorts of distractions that can come into the debate. So I want to deal with a couple of them before we start. The first one is this. The abortion debate is not about gender politics. There are some pro-choice advocates who would say that I shouldn't even be speaking on this issue. After all, abortion is a woman's issue, right? And I'm a man, so what right do I have to speak on this? The first thing to point out is that arguments don't have gender, okay? A pro-life woman could just as easily stand in my place and give you the exact same evidence, the exact same reasoning, make the exact same case for life. So gender is irrelevant when it comes to the truth of the matter or speaking out against injustice. In fact, I think we need more men and women to give a voice to the voiceless and to help defend the defenseless. Christopher Kaczor, in his book, The Ethics of Abortion, says this. He says, there is simply no such thing as the woman's perspective on abortion or the experience of women with abortion. There is no female perspective on this issue any more than there is a male perspective or a brown-eyed person's perspective. In other words, women disagree on this issue just as men do. It's also interesting that if men cannot speak on the issue of abortion, then this would seem to be reason to overturn Roe v. Wade, because Roe v. Wade was decided by 9 male Supreme Court justices. So both men and women have spoken on this issue. The second distraction is this. This debate is not about condemning people. There are many women and men who suffer from post-abortive guilt. Maybe women who have abortions, and also men who have maybe pressured a girlfriend to get an abortion. And the answer to this guilt is not further condemnation, and that's not my purpose here today. The answer to this guilt is also not denial. The answer to guilt is forgiveness and redemption and healing, and that's found in Jesus. And so if that describes any of us here today, we don't need an excuse, we need an exchange, right? Our sinfulness for Christ's righteousness. And while I'm largely dealing here with the intellectual side of abortion, I'm going to present you with a logical case for the pro-life view. I don't want that to come across as cold or calloused. So please understand my heart that we need to have reasons for what we believe and why we believe it. We also need to have a pastor's heart. We need to care for women who find themselves in difficult situations, and we need to love them as a church. So we need to remember that this is not just a head issue, but a heart issue as well. Let me start today by helping to clarify the debate. Many people think that the abortion debate is very complex, and that we have so many things that we need to think about, okay? We have to think about things like privacy, like choice, like unwanted children, and economic hardship. Not only that, but women can often face emotional and psychological trauma. The problem with this is that saying abortion is complex confuses psychological complexity and moral complexity. Let me explain what I mean by that. No one denies that the abortion issue can be psychologically complex, right? A woman may struggle mentally and emotionally with their decision regarding abortion. But it doesn't follow from this that abortion is morally complex. Despite whatever mental or emotional problems we may face, we don't kill human beings simply because they're unwanted, right? Imagine a woman who is suffering from postpartum depression, and she has a newborn in front of her. And she, because of this trauma, she's actually contemplating killing her newborn. We wouldn't say that that's a morally complex issue, despite the emotional and mental suffering that she might be going through. So an issue can be psychologically complex, that doesn't mean that it's morally complex. In that situation, we know that it's morally wrong to kill toddlers. Let me provide an illustration that helps clarify this even more. Imagine that we're 5 to 10 years down the road, all of you are married and you have children, and you're standing in your kitchen and you're washing dishes at the kitchen sink. And your son or your daughter comes up behind you and says, "Mommy, Daddy, can I kill this?" Now your back is turned, you're washing dishes, so you can't see what they're holding. What's the first question you have to ask before you can answer yes or no? What is it? Yeah. "Mommy, Daddy, can I kill this?" Well, what is it? Is it a spider? Is it a cockroach? Sure, that's fine. Just take it outside, right? Is it the next door neighbor's cat? Well, hold on a second. We're gonna have to talk, okay? Is it their little brother or sister? Now it's time to go to counseling, okay? So, what's the point of this? We can't answer the question, "Can I kill this?" until we answer the prior question, "What is it?" And so when it comes to the issue of abortion, we can't answer the question, "Can we kill the unborn?" until we answer the prior question, "What is the unborn?" And so Greg Kokel puts it this way: if the unborn is not a human person, no justification for abortion is necessary. However, if the unborn is a human person, no justification is adequate. In other words, if the unborn is not a human person, then why would we need to offer any justification at all for abortion? You can just have the abortion. If having an abortion is no different than having a kidney replaced, or having your appendix removed, or a tonsillectomy, what's the big deal? On the other hand, if the unborn is a human person, then no justification is adequate, because we can't justify killing the unborn based on the reasons that are typically offered for elective abortion. So this is the central question: what is the unborn? And in order to have a productive conversation about this topic, the debate has to be centered on this question: what is the unborn? And let me quickly illustrate how this might play out in a conversation. So imagine I'm speaking with a pro-choice advocate, and the pro-choice advocate says, "Well, look, we need to have abortion for privacy reasons. A woman has the right to do what she wants in the privacy of her own home. It's a private decision between her and our doctor." How might I respond to that? I might respond by saying, "Well, can a woman kill her toddler as long as she does it in the privacy of her own home?" Well, no, that's different. Well, why is it different? Well, because the toddler is a human being. So that's the issue, isn't it? If the unborn is a human being, like the toddler, then we can't kill the unborn because of privacy any more than we can kill the toddler. Well, look, there are a lot of economic factors that play into this. A lot of women can't afford another child. Well, if a woman can't afford her toddler, can she kill her toddler? Well, no, that's different. Well, why is it different? Well, because the toddler is a human being. So that's the issue, isn't it? If the unborn is a human being like the toddler, we can't kill the unborn for economic reasons any more than we can kill the toddler. Well, some of these children are going to be born handicapped. That's going to put a great strain on the family. Can a woman kill her handicapped toddler? Well, no, that's different. Why is it different? Well, because the toddler is a human being. So that's the issue. What is the unborn? Well, a lot of these children are unwanted. You wouldn't want to force a family to have an unwanted child. Can they kill their toddler who's unwanted? No, that's different. Why is it different? The toddler is a human being. So that's the issue. What is the unborn? That's the central issue that needs to be answered. So you'll notice that I haven't even yet begun to argue that the unborn actually is a human being. All I've done is I've centered the conversation on the one issue that matters. We want to clear away distractions and side issues that don't address that central question, what is the unborn? Imagine for a moment that instead of living now discussing the topic of abortion, imagine that we live in 1860 and we were discussing the issue of slavery. Imagine now I was discussing this topic with a pro-slavery advocate. And he said this, well, look, we need slavery for economic reasons. If we end slavery, the economy of the South is going to collapse, and then chaos will ensue. Well, can we enslave the white man to ensure a healthy and growing economy? Well, no, that's different. Well, why is it different? Well, because the white man is a human being. So that's the issue then, isn't it? If the black man is a human being like the white man, then you can't enslave the black man for economic reasons any more than you can the white man. Well, look, a slave owner has the right to do what he wants with his own property. So can a slave owner own a white man and do what he wants with his own property? Well, no, that's different. Well, why is it different? Well, because the white man is a human being. He can't be owned his property. So that's the issue, isn't it? If the black man is a human being like the white man, then he can't be owned his property either. So in the same way that slavery advocates assumed that African Americans were not human and therefore had no rights and therefore could be owned as property, pro-choice advocates today often assume that the unborn are not human beings without rights. But that's the very question that has to be resolved. What is the unborn? So you'll notice in this conversation, I used a tactic that's called trot out the toddler. And this is how this works. Whenever you hear a reason presented for abortion, ask yourself if this particular justification would also work for killing a toddler. If not, the argument assumes the unborn are not human. And so what you'll find in many of the popular sort of street level arguments that you come across on social media or on the news, in politics, they all suffer from the same problem. They beg the question in assuming the unborn is not a human being. But remember that what is the unborn is the question that has to be resolved. It's something that has to be argued for and not merely assumed, because we can't answer the question, can I kill this, until we answer the prior question, what is it? So my argument that I'm going to present this morning is very simple. And I use this argument often in my conversations, and it goes like this. It's very simple and straightforward, and it can be easily memorized. Number one, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Number two, elective abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Therefore, elective abortion is wrong. Let me point out a couple things about this argument. First, this is a valid argument, okay? If it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, and elective abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Elective abortion is wrong. If 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion is unavoidable. So the next question we have to ask is, are the statements in 1 and 2 true? The second thing to notice is that this argument cannot be dismissed as religious, okay? I've found often in conversations with people that they will attempt to dismiss me as religious, or saying that your argument is religious, or you're just pro-life because you are a Christian. And this prevents them from actually interacting with the argument, okay? But a secular pro-life advocate could just as easily use and defend this argument. In fact, many of them do. If I was an atheist, if I was not a Christian and I was an atheist, I would still be pro-life. And that's because the pro-life view can be defended on science and philosophy and not just scripture. Finally, let me define what I mean by elective abortion. What does elective abortion mean? That refers to those abortions that are not medically necessary to save the mother's life. The vast majority of abortions, over 90%, are performed for socio-economic reasons. So some people ask the question, well, look, when it comes to this whole issue of abortion, what about the cases when the mother's life is in jeopardy? This is commonly seen in cases such as ectopic pregnancy. What happens in an ectopic pregnancy is that conception takes place, but the embryo, instead of traveling down the fallopian tube and into the uterus to implant, actually plants itself in the fallopian tube. Now this is a problem because as the embryo grows, it will burst the fallopian tube, and the woman could die from internal bleeding and hemorrhaging. And so tragically in these cases, there's nothing we can do to save the life of the unborn. But if we don't do anything, the mother could also die. And so the question is this: what is the greatest moral good that we could do in these situations? And pro-life advocates agree with the principle that it is better to save one life than to lose two. But I don't think that these types of surgeries should be considered abortion because the intent is different. The intent is not to directly kill the embryo, but rather to save the life of the mother. And so while the death of the unborn is foreseen, it's not intended. The intent in these cases is to save the life of the mother. So by elective abortion then, I mean that those abortions not necessary to save the life of the mother. Now most people agree with this first statement. It's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. That seems pretty straightforward, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. What about the second premise? Elective abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Is that true? We're going to look at the science behind this statement right now. And if I could sum up the science this way, it states this: that from the earliest stages of development, the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. It's true that the unborn are not yet fully mature or developed, but they are whole human beings nonetheless. Sometimes you will hear people say things like, well, look, no one knows when life begins. But that's just not true. We've known for decades that at conception, a new human being comes into existence. So let me give you some quotes from embryologists. O'Reilly and Mueller say in their book, Human Embryology, although life is a continuous process, fertilization, which incidentally is not a moment, is a critical landmark because under ordinary circumstances, a new, genetically distinct human organism is formed when the chromosomes of the male and female pronuclei blend into the oocyte. Moore and Persaud say this: human development begins at fertilization, when a sperm fuses with an oocyte to form a single cell, the zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. The zygote divides many times and becomes progressively transformed into a multicellular human being through cell division, migration, growth, and differentiation. In their book, Before We Are Born, under the definition of zygote, they say this: this cell, formed by the union of an oocyte and sperm, is the beginning of a new human being, i.e., an embryo. Dr. Patton in Human Embryology: the formation, maturation, and meeting of a male and female sex cell are all preliminary to their actual union into a combined cell, or zygote, which definitely marks the beginning of a new individual. In other words, you have 23 chromosomes from the mother, 23 chromosomes from the father, which come together to form a new, genetically distinct human being. Living, whole human being at conception. This is what the science of embryology tells us, okay? This is something that even the more sophisticated pro-abortion choice advocates acknowledge, that the unborn are members of the human community. Some of you may be familiar with Peter Singer. He's an ethics professor at Princeton University. Singer actually argues that we should be able to kill newborns after they're born. Now, you might find that repulsive, but Singer is actually being logically consistent with his own views, because he reasons this way. Well, if we can kill the unborn, why can't we kill the newborn? I mean, there's no morally relevant difference between the two, just because they traveled 8 inches down the birth canal. Now, as a pro-life advocate, I want to use that same logic, but I want to use it in reverse. We can't kill the newborn, therefore we also can't kill the unborn, because there is no morally relevant difference between the two. But Peter Singer says this: it is possible to give human being a precise meaning. We can use it as equivalent to member of the species Homo sapiens. Whether a being is a member of a given species is something that can be determined scientifically by an examination of the nature of the chromosomes in the cells of living organisms. In this sense, there is no doubt that from the first moments of its existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and eggs is a human being. The same is true of the most profoundly and irreparably intellectually disabled human being. David Bunin, who is a philosophy professor, he actually wrote a book, A Defense of Abortion. He says this: perhaps the most straightforward relation between you and me, on the one hand, and every human fetus on the other, is this: all are living members of the same species, Homo sapiens. A human fetus, after all, is simply a human being at a very early stage in his or her development. So even these pro-choice advocates acknowledge that the unborn is a human being. We know that from science. And so what the science of embryology tells us is that each of us as individuals began to exist at conception as a distinct, living, and whole human being. Scott Klusendorf, in his book, The Case for Life, says this: you didn't come from an embryo, you once were an embryo. At no point in your prenatal development did you undergo a substantial change or change in nature. You began as a human being and will remain so until death. Sure, you lack maturity at that early stage of your life, as does an infant, but you were human nonetheless. Okay, so I've been repeating these words: distinct, living, whole human being. What do I mean by that? First of all, what do I mean by distinct? The unborn child in the womb is genetically distinct from both parents. They are not part of the mother, like a kidney or an appendix. They possess their own unique structure of chromosomes, their own DNA. They can have their own blood type, and half the time they have a different gender. They also actively direct their own internal self-development. The unborn are also living. They meet the criteria for life. They are a living organism. They are growing, they are metabolizing, they convert food to energy, and they react to stimuli. In other words, dead things don't grow, metabolize, or react to stimuli. But they're also whole. Nothing is added to the unborn after conception, such as genetic information or programming. The unborn is whole and complete. All the unborn needs to continue developing is time, nourishment, and a proper environment. In fact, that's what every other human being needs as well. When it comes to this issue of the unborn being a whole human being, it's often pointed out that one of the reasons there is a disconnect in dialogue between pro-life and pro-choice advocates has to do with this failing to understand the difference between construction and development. Is there anyone here who really likes cars, like a big car fan? So let's say that we went down to the Ford factory and we were witnessing the construction of a Mustang. And you guys have seen the factory lines, how they work. Imagine that we're there standing at the beginning, we see the first two metal plates come together. How many of you would say that we have a Mustang at that point? Anybody? Probably not, right? Maybe it's a Mustang, maybe it's a refrigerator, maybe it's a stove, right? We don't know yet. Okay, so we travel down the factory line, we see the metal plates come together, now we see the frame of the car come together. How many of you would say that we have a Mustang at that point? Travel a little bit further, the engine is dropped in, okay? travel a little further, the body is placed on, and then at the end of the line, that Mustang is ready to roll off the line, right? If I was to ask you, when do we really have a Mustang? Many of you would probably say, well, it's when that Mustang is ready to roll off the line, right? That's how many people view the development of the unborn. They think that the unborn is sort of put together externally, piece by piece. And so when you say that abortion kills a whole human being, right, that doesn't even register with them. What do you mean? How can an 8-cell embryo be a whole human being? That doesn't even make sense. Let me contrast that with another analogy. My mom's side of the family is from Scotland. So let's suppose that we go on a trip to Scotland and we are at the lake of Loch Ness, right? All you guys have heard of Loch Ness Monster. And when we go on this trip, we bring those old school Polaroid cameras. You guys know those where you take a picture and it takes like 5 years to develop and you have to shake it like this and all that stuff, right? Now let's suppose we're on this tour boat and at just the right time, you see the Loch Ness Monster come up out of the water. You're there with your Polaroid camera, you snap that perfect shot, and just as you finish, it goes back into the water and disappears. Now that picture comes out, right? You're excited, man, you can make some money off of this picture, right? Imagine that I took that picture and I tore it up right in front of you. I said, there's nothing on that picture. It's just some smudges. What would you say to me in response? You might say to me in response, you might say, the Loch Ness Monster was there, but you just couldn't see it yet. This is a more accurate picture of what happens in the development of the unborn. So here's the point. The unborn is not constructed externally from the outside. No one is arguing that the unborn is fully developed, but a newborn isn't fully developed either. But the unborn is a whole human being nonetheless. Like the Polaroid picture, you were there at those early stages of development, but we just couldn't see you yet. Okay? Like the Polaroid picture, you just needed time to develop. Everything was there, everything was in place. We just couldn't see you yet. Finally, the unborn is human. The unborn has human parents and a human genetic signature. Okay, the unborn is not a cat being or a dog being, it is a human being. It's a human organism. And if someone wants to say that's not human, right, they have to answer the question of how two human beings can produce offspring that isn't human, but later becomes one. So the unborn from conception, a distinct, living, and whole human being. This is what the science of embryology tells us. Okay, so let's look at our argument again. We just talked about number 2, that elective abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Now, if the science is correct, that means that human beings begin to exist at conception, and that supports this second statement, which would mean that elective abortion kills an innocent human being. But science has limits. Science can tell us that the unborn are human, but science can't tell us how we should treat the unborn any more than it can tell us how we can treat newborns or adults. So what about this first statement up here? It's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. This seems obvious to a lot of people. But there are pro-choice advocates who attempt to get around this and argue that it's okay to kill the unborn because while the unborn may be a human being, they're not a human person. Pro-choice advocates will say, well, okay, we'll grant you the scientific evidence. The unborn is a human being, but the unborn is not a human person. Now, whenever this issue arises, the first question you should ask is this: what's the difference? What's the difference between a human being and a human person? If you are going to say that there is a certain group of human beings that don't qualify as human persons, and therefore we can kill them, then you have to have an answer to this question. That scenario has been played out various times in history, and it never ends well for that group of human beings who are deemed to not count as one of us. Think about the Jews during the Holocaust, or African Americans during slavery. They may have been human beings, but they weren't considered human persons with rights, and therefore we can kill them. Therefore we can enslave them. In these situations, pro-choice advocates will usually offer up certain qualities or characteristics or properties that they believe disqualify the unborn from being human persons. And so they'll say things like this: well, the unborn doesn't look human, or it's too small. Well, the unborn isn't developed enough. The unborn is still dependent on the mother for life. All of these differences that are pointed out by pro-choice advocates, differences between the unborn human being that you once were and the adult human being that you are today, they can be placed in one of four categories. Not one of these categories is morally relevant or can serve as justification for killing you back then. And we can summarize these differences with the acronym SLED: size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. So real quickly, let's look at each one of these and see if they can serve as justification for elective abortion. Okay, what about the first one, size? It's true that the unborn are smaller than newborns or adults. But why is that relevant? Is it our size that gives us value or a right to life? Men are generally larger than women. Does that mean that men are somehow more human? Does that mean that men somehow have more value or more of a right to life? I think we can understand that size doesn't equal value. In fact, even my kids understand this. There's a Dr. Seuss movie called Horton Hears a Who, and there's a line in that movie that's repeated throughout. A person's a person, no matter how small. What about the second one? What about level of development? It's true that the unborn is less developed than you and I. But again, why does that matter? Newborns are less developed than toddlers. Toddlers are less developed than adolescents. And adolescents are less developed than adults. If our value is somehow based on our development, does that mean that it's worse to kill an adult than a newborn? If our value or our right to life is based on development, then there is nothing to prevent the strong from killing the weak. In fact, isn't it true that those members of the human community who are less developed and weaker and more defenseless are those who are more needful and worthy of our protection? When I watch the news and I see these horrific crimes that are committed against children, we realize that children need to be protected exactly because they are more vulnerable and defenseless. And so if that's true of little children, how much more of the unborn? What about environment? It's true that the unborn are inside the mother's womb. But again, why is that relevant? Where you are has no bearing on who you are. Each of us changes location every day. We change location all the time. Do we somehow become more or less valuable or human? How is it that an 8-inch journey down the birth canal changes the nature of the unborn from non-human to human? Right? There's nothing magical or mysterious about the birthing process that grants us value or a right to life. If the unborn are not already human, merely changing their location can't make them valuable. What about this last one? Degree of dependency. It's true the unborn are dependent on their mothers, but again, why does that matter? Newborns may be dependent on their mothers as well. Does that mean that we can kill them? What about adults who are dependent on insulin or kidney dialysis? Are they somehow less human or less valuable because of their dependency? While it's true that we may be dependent on others for our survival, we're not dependent on others for our value. Okay? So this is the question. What is it that makes us valuable? The pro-life view argues that each of us as human beings are equal by nature and not by function. In other words, each one of us is valuable simply in light of being what we are, human beings who share a common human nature. We are not valuable because of some function we can perform, but if that's the case, then the unborn are included as well as valuable members of the human community, since they too share our common human nature. Scott Klusendorf again says this in his book. He says, opponents of the pro-life view assert without justification the belief that strong and independent humans have basic human rights, while small and dependent ones do not. This view is elitist. It violates the principle that once made political liberalism great, a commitment to protect the most vulnerable members of the human community. Now contrast that with the pro-life view, which argues that no human being, regardless of size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency, should be excluded from the human family. In other words, this view of humanity is inclusive, it is wide open to all, especially to those who are small, vulnerable, and defenseless. On July 1st, 1854, Lincoln wrote a small fragment to address some of the popular arguments that were put forward by slavery advocates, who argued that whites should have the right to enslave blacks based on certain qualities and characteristics such as color or intellect. We can learn a lot from Lincoln's logic and how he demonstrates the bankruptcy of some of these pro-slavery arguments. This is what Lincoln said. He said, "You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own." You do not mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them? Take care again. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But, say you, it is a question of interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Okay, what is Lincoln saying here? What is his point? His point is this. If you try to establish human rights or human value or personhood based on some arbitrary, irrelevant property, like color or intellect, a property that none of us share equally, then what you end up doing is you end up undermining human rights for everyone. But what slavery advocates did in the past, abortion advocates do today. Only instead of arguing that blacks are non-persons and can therefore be enslaved, they argue that the unborn are non-persons based on size, development, and dependency, and therefore they can be killed. But the reasoning of the abortion advocates is just as flawed as the slavery advocates. So if Lincoln were alive today and were to address the abortion debate, or if we were to apply his logic to the abortion debate, might say something like this. You say A is big and B is small. It is size then, the larger having the right to kill the smaller. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a victim of the first man you meet with a larger body than your own. You do not mean size exactly. You mean human persons are developmentally the superiors of the unborn and therefore have the right to kill them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be a victim of the first man you meet with a development superior to your own. But say you is a question of interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to kill the unborn. Very well. And if another can make it his interest, he has the right to kill you. Again, Scott Klusendorf says, in the past, we used to discriminate on the basis of skin color and gender, and still do at times. But now with elective abortion, we discriminate on the basis of size, level of development, location, and degree of dependency. We've simply swapped one form of bigotry for another. Many of you are probably familiar with Stephen Hawking, who passed away. Stephen Hawking was a brilliant scientist and a writer. You also may know that he suffered from a rare form of Lou Gehrig's disease, and this kept him bound to a wheelchair, and he was heavily dependent on others. He lost the ability to physically interact with his environment. But despite this, listen to what two biographers said about Stephen Hawking in their book. They said Stephen Hawking does not like to dwell too much on his disabilities, and even less on his personal life. He would rather people thought of him as a scientist first, popular science writer second, and in all ways that matter, a normal human being with the same desires, drives, dreams, and ambitions as the next person. In other words, despite his disabilities, Hawking wants to be considered in all ways that matter a normal human being. It's interesting that whenever people attempt to define what it means to be a valuable person, they always define it in such a way that includes themselves and those that they love. Stephen Hawking and his biographers would never say that in order to be a valuable human person, you have to be able to physically interact with your environment, because then Stephen Hawking would be out. Now, what if I was having a conversation with Hawking, and I said, I'm sorry, Stephen, but what makes human beings valuable, what makes you a human person, is your ability to function and physically interact with your environment. I mean, let's be honest, Stephen. Evolution is about survival of the fittest. And if we were in the wild, you wouldn't last 2 seconds. Would we then be justified in killing Stephen Hawking based on our criteria for human personhood? Well, of course not. Stephen Hawking is still valuable, still possesses a right to life, not because of his functional ability, even if he wasn't a scientist, but simply because he is human. But if that's the case, then the unborn should be included as well, based on their humanity. Whenever we attempt to separate human persons from non-persons based on arbitrary qualities and characteristics, it always allows the powerful to oppress the weak. And it justifies disposing of human beings simply because they are in the way and can't defend themselves. But this is exactly what many pro-choice advocates are doing with the unborn. They are saying the unborn don't qualify as valuable persons because they cannot yet do X, whatever X may be, and therefore we can kill them. But this confuses functioning as a human being with being human, and ultimately it undermines human equality and value for all of us. Stephanie Gray from the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform says this. She says, the pro-choice view of personhood is human plus birth, or human plus consciousness, or human plus viability. But how is this different from those who say personhood is human plus white skin, or human plus male gender, or human plus an IQ higher than 70? Why not just saying being human is enough? If the pro-life view is correct, then all of you are safe. All of you are valuable human persons, because every human being is a human person. But if the pro-choice view is correct, and we can kill human beings who are not human persons, then none of us are safe. Because any one of us can be defined out of human personhood by someone who comes along and is stronger and more powerful than us. This is why the abortion debate is more than just about abortion. It's about who counts as one of us. What makes us valuable? Are we valuable because of some function we can perform? Or do we have inherent value simply in light of what we are? Are we valuable because of what we are? If I was to go around the room right now and ask each one of you, I bet all of you would say that you believe in human rights. and the idea that all human beings should be treated equally. The question is why? What is it that makes all of us deserving of equal treatment and possessors of the same basic rights? Each one of us in this room is different. We are different races, we are different sexes, we possess different abilities and functions, we have different beliefs and convictions. So what is it? If each of us is to be treated equally, and we all possess the same basic human rights, there has to be some quality or characteristic that we all share equally in common. So what is it? There is one quality we all have equally, and that is that we're all human. And being human is not a degreed property. It's not something that you can be more or less of. You're either human or you're not. We all have a human nature and we all have it equally. But if that's the case, if it's our humanity that grounds our equality and value and rights, then the unborn are included as well, as equal and valuable members of the human community, as well as possessors of basic rights from the time that they come into existence at conception. Stephen Wagner says this: why are sexism and racism wrong? Isn't it because they pick out a surface difference, such as gender or skin color, and ignore the underlying similarity all of us share? We should treat women and men, African Americans and whites, as equal and protect them from discrimination. Why? Because they all have a human nature. But if the unborn also has the same human nature, shouldn't we protect her as well? If I had 10 seconds to sum up the pro-life view, if someone were to ask me, why are you pro-life, and I have 10 seconds to get an answer out, this is what I would say. The reason I'm pro-life is because the unborn is growing, so it must be alive. She has human parents, so she must be human. And human beings are valuable and deserve to be protected, don't they? As we engage this issue, I think there's 4 areas that we need to engage in. Number 1, we have to simplify the debate and clarify what the debate is really about. What is the unborn? We have to show from science that the unborn are human. We have to show from philosophy, that's the SLED test that I gave you, that there's no essential difference between unborn human beings and adults. And we have to answer objections convincingly. Some people ask, what can we do from here? There are a lot of things that we can do. If you feel that this is an area that God has called you to minister to, we can pray, we can read, we can study, and we can engage in conversations. There are many pro-life families that adopt. Oftentimes the pro-life movement is criticized. Well, you guys just care about unborn babies, but you aren't willing to do anything after they're born. That's not true at all. Crisis pregnancy centers in this country actually outnumber abortion clinics 2 to 1. And at these crisis pregnancy centers, women are able to get both pre and postnatal care. Free formula, free diapers. One of the organizations that we help support is Nesting Place, which is over on Margaret Street. They take in women who have no place to go, who are pregnant. They preach the gospel to them. They care for them, and they care for their children. So that's just one example where we donate, clothes and toys to an organization such as that. We can also volunteer at pregnancy centers, help women in need, offer healing and mercy to post-abortive women and men. And we really need to love people. Again, even though this is kind of more of an intellectual, logical case for the pro-life view, I hope you do understand my heart that we really do need to love women. As a church, we need to love our friends and family members and care for them, especially those who are involved in what are considered crisis pregnancies. So, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle agreed on this statement. They all agreed that it is better to suffer injustice than to inflict it. It's better to suffer injustice than to inflict it. I think that adoption will always be a better solution than abortion. So I would encourage adoption in that situation. There's also another assumption that is sometimes made by pro-choice advocates, and that is this. The assumption is that abortion will somehow solve the problem of rape. And that's just not true. There's an individual by the name of Nicole Cooley, and she wrote a book, and in her book she describes her own journey. She was raped, and after being raped, she had an abortion. And later on in life, she was introduced to Jesus, and she became a Christian. And what she says in her book is that the trauma of abortion was actually worse for her to endure than the trauma of rape. We somehow think that abortion will somehow undo the rape. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about undoing that horrific evil that's been done. Let me just close in prayer real quick. Father, we thank you for this time. Thank you for this group. I ask that, I pray that the information today was helpful. I pray that you would give us something to think about. I pray that we would be stirred up to love our unborn neighbors and to help protect those who are vulnerable, protect those who are defenseless, and love and care for the women who find themselves in difficult situations. Be with us this week, Lord. Bring us again together. In Jesus' name, amen.